Legendary lords not only lead factions but also armies, and that means they need to get their hands dirty in battle. But which lords are the very best at fighting and can single-handedly win against anything you put them up against? Let's get to listing and find out. And just so you know, we're going to max power with all abilities and items, but no campaign skills since that gets kind of out of hand really fast and would make this video a whole lot harder to make. Okay, thank you, list time. Coming in 10th place we have Gor-Rok. The Great Pale Lizard, which isn't just my nickname when I go to the beach, has always been a force to be reckoned with in battle. He has great melee stats, impressive damage for is essentially a footlord. This lets him take on other lords and heroes or swarms of infantry and monsters with relative ease, cutting down most foes he comes across. But his main power for sure comes from how ridiculously tanky he is. 100 armor is a nice base to build up from, but then add on a silver shield, 60 defense, physical and missile resistance, and then all of his abilities, which bring him an array of buffs to both offense and defense, as well as to nearby troops. Gor-Rok is perhaps the best definition of leading from the front. Yeah, he can do great work himself, but he is for sure best when used alongside other troops. And I know that's a bit of a moronic statement since, yeah, no shit, every lord is going to be better when they're not alone, but for this guy, we're talking specific synergies. Two abilities which affect units in an area around him are kinda not as great when they're just hitting him. Still, he's an amazing lord to have in combat, even if he does lean slightly more on the defensive side of things rather than offensive. He's getting no higher because of this and a lack of any spells alongside his kickassary in combat, which, as this list goes on, you're going to see a lot of. Coming in 9th place we have Throgg. So the Brass Bull is kind of the exact opposite of Gor-Rok in the sense that he is all about offense and pretty much nothing else. Now don't get me wrong, he is still crazily tanky. We're talking 130 armor and 47 defense, so it's hardly like he's out there dressed like a female MMO character, though that would be an interesting ensemble. He's a little larger, so easy to hit from a range, but has missile resist, so it's not as bad as it seems. But on the offense side of things, good lord, this guy is so offensive. He'd probably get banned on Twitter, then unbanned when it turned to X in the interest of free speech. 53 attack and a stonking 500 weapon strength, with nearly 400 of that being armor piercing. Attack on 54 charge bonus and a tide of abilities, and you're onto a lord who's borderline unstoppable. I'll stick him on screen, but if you're not into any of that nerd shit like reading, I'll summarize by saying that this guy starts out strong and then somehow gets even stronger the more he kills, which, let's be honest, won't be that much of a challenge. Once everything is up and running, he can get over 100 more armor piercing damage and 60 more melee attack alongside 24 defense and a flat 40% damage resistance. He quite literally is both the unstoppable force and the immovable object, and can lead his army from anywhere on the map, or simply be the army if you build him up for that job. Now again, he's not getting any higher because at the end of the day, he's just a melee lord with no ranged spells, so if enemies are out of his reach, there's not a lot you can do about it but run on over and hope he doesn't get picked apart on the way. Still an outstanding powerhouse, but it'll go no further while I'm sheriff around these parts. Coming in 8th place we have Teclis, now for a totally different type of lord. Teclis in combat is honestly a bit of a dweebus. Low armor, melee stats and damage, and even once he's on his endgame mount, he still doesn't compare to the other two we just talked about. So why is he on this list? Well, he also happens to be quite possibly one of the best spellcasters in game. He has a unique mix of spells, and while I personally wouldn't call any of them super duper S tier overpowered, they're all great choices, taking some of the best spells from other lores to mix into his own. On top of this, he gets numerous passives from the lores for a ton of free effects every single time he lets out a cast. On his Phoenix, he can gain magical damage and gain damage resistance when he has lots of magic. He can regen magic into his reserves and active pool, self-heal for nearly a third of his total HP, has an extra bounce spell, which is actually a super duper overpowered one. Honestly, you could use this guy, never let him see combat, and get great value, so throwing him on a Phoenix and getting him some mid-range combat is the icing on the cake. Now yeah, all of these spells and abilities, and the fact that you have to choose what combat to send him into, do make him a little bit harder to use, but if you use him right, he is outstanding in combat and can carry your battles fairly well, which is impressive for such a skinny dude. And he's simply not going higher because there are lords which can do almost as much spell damage and still kick a ton of ass in melee, so they're just edging him out to be a little bit higher. Coming in 7th place we have Archaon the Everchosen. Going from a little twinky elfman to an alpha chad Everchosen of the Chaos Gods, Archaon is a real monster in battle, despite being a footlord. The fact that he is here above literal demons which are in the same faction is a testament to just how great this dude is, and oh boy, he's fabulous. So melee stuff first, and he is a beast. 120 armor, stupid high melee stats, and a ton of armor piercing damage alongside fire and magical damage, and a shield to keep things even. Toss him on a mount, and he's also super duper fast and has great charge, whilst losing nothing but a tier of shield. He can fight basically anything and come out on top, and even with the hitbox increase his mount brings, still be a pretty small target both in melee and from a ranged, so nigh on impossible to take down without losing some health of your own. Alongside this insanity in melee, he also has a lineup of some pretty great spells. Similar to Teclis, nothing aside from Burning Head I would consider to be overpowered, but still you have some great damage and buffs to take on pretty much any enemy you come up against. And he also has all of his abilities to drastically improve his and his allies' stats and send him from being just kind of strong to being outright terrifying. Literally, one of his items lets him cause terror. And remember, all these stats are packed into a lord on a horse, so hardly an easy tag to pick off either from a range or in melee. He can take on other lords and heroes one-on-one, mow down hordes of infantry with ease, and zip around the map hunting down pretty much whatever you want him to. The only thing that can slow him down is a really big wall, so as long as you don't end up fighting one of those, you should be just fine. Coming in 6th place, we have Astragoth Ironhand. Should I really let Astragoth on this list since he's kind of abusing performance-enhancing exosuits? Well, look at him, we have no rules against doping here at the COLONELDAMNEDERS Institute for Video Game Ranking. Don't do drugs though, it's not good. Anyway, Astragoth has everything Archaon has, but just a little bit turned up in some ways and only a smidge turned down in others. He has more armor and weapon strength and isn't as fast as Archaon on the mount, but is still plenty speedy in this very small package. Honestly, they'll perform more or less the same in melee, so I'm happy putting them as equals, at least in this category. However, on the magical and ability side of things, he's much better, in my opinion. His spells are a mix of fire and Hashut, and while he may not have the most overpowered choices from either lore, it's still plenty to whoop most things he comes across, armored or not. For his abilities, he has 2 spell passives, so more free value, and 2 stacking abilities which will only get better the more he kills and takes damage, and another massive damage boost for good measure. And lastly, whilst Archaon is stopped by walls, this guy can break them. Okay, I was kind of memeing on that last part, but still, taking down walls and gates fast can be pretty useful, so I'm not complaining. To be honest, I think an argument could be made for either of these guys to be better than the other, but for me, it just came down to the great melee performance in the smaller package and a great set of spells I just happen to prefer more. If you disagree, that's fine, but you're wrong, so cope harder, nerds. Coming in 5th place, it is Count Noctilus. I mean, it was inevitable we'd come across the undead at some point in this list. Their lords carry the faction most of the time, and for the Vampire Coast, none do it better than Noctilus. Now, baseline, he is worse than Astragoth in everything but melee defense. Now, he's not bad by any means. In fact, he's still really damn strong. Great armor, melee stats, huge damage with armor piercing, and a bonus versus large, so still nothing to scoff at. Once he gets on his necrofex, he does lose a few numbers in defense and armor, weapon strength, but gains a crapload of HP and of course a ton of range damage, making him into an artillery piece as well as a melee superstar, at the slight downside of being a fairly large hitbox. It's going to be a bit easier to take down from a range, but still, with range damage like that, he can keep his distance for a good long time anyway, so it hardly matters. Over on the magical side of things, and he probably has the best combo yet, we got damage, summons, and healing from the very powerful Lore of the Vampires, and even more damage and debuffs from the Lore of Shadows, and then sprinkle on some regen, magic and HP, summons, and bombardment to polish things off. Noctilus really is the definition of an all-rounder. Great in melee, excellent range damage, great spell damage, utility, healing for himself and allies, and a couple of summons, as well as a massive HP bar. The only downside is that massive size, so keep him away from enemy ranged, and you should have a great time. But of course, when it comes to undead, there can only be one true Chad to rule them all. That is, of course, our next entrant, Vlad von Carstein. Vlad the Daddy Chaddy von Carstein has always been a force to be reckoned with, and in Immortal Empires, he's no different, baby. He may just be a simple footlord with no mount, but he's still damn good. So let's go through why. Now yes, he's a little bit worse in most areas compared to Astragoth still, but he has higher melee attack, so will land a massive number of attacks with constant massive damage no matter what he's fighting. He also has great spell power. He may be limited to just the Lore of the Vampires, but if you're going to have a single lore, then it's a pretty great one to have. Buffs, debuffs, and damage alongside the reason Vlad is quite so strong, regeneration. Not only does he have the Invocation of Nehek to himself and allies, but he also has the Curse of Undeath passive for more armor healing whenever he casts anything, the Hunger to heal himself whenever he's in melee, and the Blood Drinker Sword for just a little bit more constantly. This means it's basically impossible for him to die without reaching the regen cap, meaning enemies pretty much have to kill him twice to get rid of him for good. Add on his leadership, melee tap debuffs for enemies, and a massive 60% damage resist for himself, and you have a lord that can take down armies of lesser enemies in the span of his very, very long lifespan. And remember, this is all in the package of a single footlord, so he's not the easiest of targets to snipe from a range or focus down with high melee damage. Massive damage, great spell utility, insane regeneration, and a small dude. Unless you're a girl on Tinder, what's not to love? Coming in 3rd place, we have Yuan Bo. The newest lord to hit Grand Cathay and by far the most overpowered. More armor than either of his siblings and nearly double their armor piercing damage in human form, but surprisingly just a little bit worse than Miao Ying in dragon form. Still, human form is the way to go for getting the most out of this frankly obscenely overpowered lord. On the magical side of things, he has the mix of yin, yang, light, and high magic, and honestly, he has some of the best from all of them. We're talking high damage across the board, and a net to keep enemies still, letting him throw as much damage as he wants at targets, be that in melee or with more spells. As for abilities and items, I mean, he has some nice stat buffs and spell passes, but all you really need to see is the Emperor's Executioner, the only ability in the game which can execute targets below 20% HP, wiping that fifth of their HP out in one fell swoop and banishing them straight to the Shadow Realm. He starts out with one use, but can get more in campaign, making him a terror to go up against. Now I know I said I wasn't going to mention campaign skills, but this one is so obscenely overpowered I just have to. Things can be going just fine, but once your lord or hero, or anything for that matter, gets below 20% HP, kiss it goodbye, because it's going to be gone in seconds. This ability alone could get him on this list. Add on his excellent spellbook, outstanding melee abilities, and all of this in his tiny footlord hitbox, and he is one of the most overpowered lords in the game so far. So who could be better than a lord which can literally execute anything? Well, we've got two more entrants, let's find out. Coming in second place, we have the Changeling. Honestly, it's hard to quantify just how overpowered the Changeling is because it really depends on what other lords you're changing into in battles. Don't get me wrong, the base form is fine. Decent melee stats, weapon damage, and mid to low toughness. A lot of the siege spells are good and all, but of course, this alone isn't enough to make the list. Of course, the most overpowered part about the Changeling is the form switching because it allows him to become literally any other legendary lord or hero in the game. This means you can quite literally become Vlad or Yuan Bo or anyone else on this list along with all their spells and abilities. Now there are some limitations like no abilities that switch forms, no items, and no mounts, so you can't use every lord to the absolute max of their abilities, but you can still come pretty damn close to everyone's final form. Yuan Bo specifically, you can get his human form, all the spells, and the executioner ability, so all you really miss out on is the dragon form, which you don't really want to use anyway. So, what I'm getting at is, you can be whoever you want, including third place, as well as being a pretty decent spellcaster of Siege. So it does beg the question, who can possibly be number one? Well, if you've ever played the game before, you know that number one is of course Malus Darkblade, the one lord that the Changeling just cannot replicate to his full power. Now, I know, Malus has no spells, no range, and even with his mount he's not all that fast, so he's more or less a standard frontlines battler. So just why is he number one? Well, dear viewer, he's just simply that damn overpowered at what he does. He may be a standard battler, but oh my god, he is just so fucking good at it. Great armor, high attack and defense, exceptional damage, and very high leadership. Add on items to deal more damage, debuff enemies, and an item that lets him passively replenish HP and gain just a touch of damage resistance. Oh yeah, let's not forget that you can transform into Sarkhan to get a whole new health bar, become unbreakable, get a new set of abilities, and somehow improved stats from before. So, you can fight the world until he runs out of HP in his base form, which can take an extremely long time with the insane stats and regen. Then, get a whole new health bar and take on another planet whilst the regen just keeps on coming. It's hard to explain why Malus is so unkillable until you've tried to kill him. The dude just does not die and takes down hordes of units in the process. And remember, this is all in a tiny hitbox, so enemy ranged don't stand a chance, and no matter how much you surround him in melee, he's still not going to take too many hits at once. There is a reason Malus is known as the one-man army. There is simply no one who does it better. And that's my list. Did I miss someone that you think should have made it? Let me know down in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and if you want to know what the very best units are to go alongside these lords, then check out this video here to see my list.